would even notice it was gone. People that drive by wouldn't even notice it was there or that it was gone. The sign's been there for 30 years, the building's been there for 30 years, and it's never had any impact on my life. That's a marginal church. And that's not an indictment on any church, it's just a fact that, that's it's just the way it is. It's just true. Because the purpose of a church is to make Christ-like disciples. The reason we exist is to multiply and advance his kingdom. We don't exist to advance our kingdom, but often we think of that. In fact, a marginal church often only thinks the reason for bringing new people in is to support their financial needs moving forward and to fill up their seats. We're not trying to reach people because they're lost and going to hell. We're trying to reach them because people are leaving and we got to fill our holes. Or people are leaving, we need more money. That really, ultimately, is why most churches really try to grow. They're not growing for the right purpose. It's not because they're broken over lost and broken people. It's because they're broken because they don't have as much reputation as they used to have when the church was larger or whatever it was. And so a lot of the things I'm going to say about this may, if you're not careful, you might think that they're a little too direct. But we only have an hour to do this, and I'm going to try to do my best to get through it as quickly as I can and give you some illustrations, and then I want to leave some time for some Q&A at the end. By the way, if I'm talking through this and you have any questions or anything you'd like to yell at me about or complain or criticize, just raise your hand, really, and I'd love to have conversations because I think we learn best when we interact. So we're going to go get right into this. And you have the notes. It says marginal to missional, transitioning to local church. Get this thing rolling. So I want to just say a couple things about this and starting. Number one, in the New Testament church, they all preached. I don't think this is in your notes. This is stuff you can write down. They all preached. Not just the apostles. In fact, if you read Acts 7:59 to 8:4, you find in that experience, this is when Stephen was stoned, right? When Stephen was stoned in Acts chapter 7:59, it was like they called it the diaspora. What happened after Stephen was stoned was a diaspora, or the dispersion of the church. The church exploded out from Jerusalem. It says, when Stephen was stoned, it said, all but the apostles were scattered. So the preachers stayed in Jerusalem, right? The apostles. It says, all but the apostles scattered. It says, wherever they went, they spoke the word of God boldly. So the idea of a church being for us, just so you'll know, it should be encouraging to you and I don't know anything about your church, so please, anything I say, don't take it as a personal indictment. I don't know your church, so whatever I say is about my experiences with other churches. But the idea that the church is about itself is what the Jerusalem church believed until Stephen. It's what they lived. So it's humanly natural for us to enjoy each other's company, enjoy each other's fellowship, and have a nice church for us. It's human. We like that. We like to close our circles. We like to be comfortable with everybody, intimate with everybody. We think that we minister best to those who are most like us. And from a human perspective, that's really true. It takes the Spirit to change us from that, and to make us reach people that are not like us, to make us learn to find people that we're not comfortable with until they're transformed, until they're comfortable with us. So you understand, and the church is a spiritual entity. Unfortunately, it's become more secularized. And so we think more secularly about the church, and we think, well, the church is for us. It's for me. And we hire staff to care for our kids. We hire children's pastors to care for our children. We hire teen pastors to care for our teens. I know this because I was a youth pastor for 9 years. In the church in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was Little Rock First Church. I was on staff for 4 years as the youth pastor. And the youth group had about six when I came there. We were 2 blocks from the high school. 2 blocks. Our church was 2 blocks from the high school. Really, it was only a block and a half. And we had 6 teens in a church of 350. 6 teens. And so I came there out of seminary, and I was all, full of spizzerinctum, and, I was ready to go, man. I hit the ground, I'm running around, getting people saved, and I get people come in from every different color and every different shape and size. People came in with mohawks and black people and brown people and weird white people with tattoos and all kinds of spikes and, piercings and stuff. This is in the South. So that stuff wasn't as common in Arkansas as it might have been in other places. But, that's who we were reaching. We were just reaching lost kids. And 3 years in, my lead pastor came to me and had a meeting with me. He was very kind. he said, Mark, I want you to know how grateful we are for the ministry you've been doing. You've done an amazing job. The youth group has gone from 6 to about 120 in 3 years. It's wonderful. He said, however, the parents of the teens who pay your salary have made it very clear to me that we have to stop reaching new kids and we have to focus on the kids whose parents pay your salary. So you can't reach any more new teens. You can spend the next several years. Well, I mean, for most people, you might go, oh, cool. All I got to do is just love on the kids that already know me. But this is the difference between being secular and spiritual in your thinking. Are we a church or are we a secular organization? It's the same principle that matches this whole concept, right? Marginal is a church that's focused on their resources, their gifts, never takes a risk. All the finances are nailed down. Every dollar is accounted for. And we make sure we have plenty of dollars for the next 10 years before we spend anything for lost people. That's a secular organization. A sacred organization does what God tells them, even if they don't have the resources. In fact, they do things because they don't have resources, because faith presumes risk. So at that point, after that meeting with my pastor, I love him. I don't criticize him. He was a mentor in my life. In fact, he called me. He's like 89 years old. He called me the other day. He said, I want you to come do my funeral. So we have a good, he wasn't dead yet, but he was saying, when I die, I want you to come do my funeral. So I just want to remind you that everyone preached. We believe in something called the priesthood of all believers. That's a Protestant basic. Every Protestant church embraces the theme of the priesthood of all believers, but few Protestant churches actually practice the theme of the priesthood of all believers. And few Christians do, but the New Testament tells us that we're all believers and we're all priests. So that's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing is they reached people others would not reach. They reached people others would not. Somebody want to turn to Acts 11, 19 to 21 and read real quick. James, can you get that? Acts 11, 19 to 21.
Now those who had been scattered because of the persecution that took place over Stephen went as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, speaking the message to no one but Jews. But there were some men from Cyprus and Cyrene among them who came to Antioch and began to speak to the Greeks too, proclaiming the good news of the Lord Jesus. The hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord.
So they start reaching everyone. And so we have to understand if we're going to be a missional church, we have to be willing to do crossover ministry. That is, we have to be willing to reach people who are not like those who are in our pews. That's where the rub comes. You know, I loved it. There was a guy in my church who was a golfer. He was a professional golfer, and he was retired in Atlanta First Church. It was the last church I pastored before I was elected DS in Joplin. And this guy came to me one time, and he said, Pastor, when are we going to start reaching some people like me? White, upper income, $150,000 a year salary, nice car, $500,000 home. When are we going to start reaching people like that? Don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, don't run with people that do. You know, don't do drugs. You know, I smell nice. That's what he was saying. And I just told him, I said, Gary, I said, the people like you are already Christians. I don't want to reach them. I want to reach the people that are not like you and maybe make them like Jesus. I didn't say make them like him because I love Gary, but I don't think we all want to be like Gary. And so they reach people. So we have to be willing to do crossover ministry. I'm pastoring a black church in Kansas City, and I'm not black, if you hadn't noticed. And I told God that I wasn't black, and who does he think he is asking me to pastor a black church? And he said, you're my child, and what you do is based on the Spirit, not on your flesh. And so we have to understand that it's a huge transition to move from reaching people who are like us to reaching people who are not like us. But that's what the New Testament church did, right? Then they acted like Jesus. Acts 11, 26. Do you want to read that one? Brother? Acts 11, 26.
26 to 28.
Yeah, read them both.
And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught a significant number of people. Now it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians.
Why? Hold on, pause for a minute. Why were they called Christians? No, because they acted like Jesus. They reminded the people of what they heard about Jesus. It was They were followers of Christ, but they were like Christ. They acted like him. So they acted like Jesus. Then number 4, keep on reading, please.
One of them, named Agabus, got up and predicted by the Spirit that a severe famine was about to come over the whole inhabited world. This took place during the reign of Claudius.
Okay, so the Spirit, God used them. What we're talking about is the difference between a Christian or a body of people who are secular and everything they could do if the Spirit was there or not, versus a body that operates in the Spirit and the evidences of the Spirit are practicing in that body. The difference between a marginal church and a missional church. A marginal church does what they can do with their resources, with their time, with their talents, and with all that they have. A missional church does what you can do with the Spirit's there. Are you kind of getting my drift here? And then they multiplied Christians and churches. So if you read Acts chapter 13, whoa, this thing just went crazy. Let me go back. Wow. It really went crazy. Okay, good. It catches up. You know, if I'm clicking, I can't get it to go to the next slide. I keep clicking, and then in a few minutes it goes through all of them. So sorry. So they multiplied Christians and church. If you read Acts 13, 1 through 2, you'll see that. We're not going to take time to do that. We're going to go right into this next section. I want to give you some basic pictures and parameters of the difference between a marginal church and a missional church. This is practical stuff, okay? So a marginal church is a church that almost everything you do is for you. Almost everything you do is primarily for us. Like I said earlier, you hire staff to take care of you. We hire a pastor to take care of us. This will illustrate that. So when I was called to go pastor the Albuquerque church, the Sandia church, in 1996, the DS picked me up at the airport. Has anybody ever been to Albuquerque? Well, so in Albuquerque, the airport is way south of town. It's way south, and of course, it's near one of the worst areas of town, the Gibson area. It's called the war zone. From the airport up until you get to, I don't know, maybe Missional, there's probably 3 or 4 miles of what's called the war zone. It's a horrible area. So I landed, and the district superintendent picked me up at the airport and took me around here to the I-25, way out kind of west and north, around all the bad stuff. Then he exited up way north of town on Paseo del Norte, which is where the $1 million homes are and the finest golf courses are. And he exited, he got off, and he came back down towards the church, which was really, really close to the airport. And as he took me through there, he told me about all the wonderful things. He said, this is a great church. It's about 220 people. He says they have a good salary. They'll pay you good. The schools are good. It's a safe. He showed me the parsonage. Like back then, it was 1996. I mean, about $100,000 salary. That was a pretty good salary in 1996. You know, $96,000. That was good. Told me about the salary. Told me about all the people and how wonderful and safe and comfortable and how the schools were good and the environment was good. Everything was good. And he showed me this beautiful parsonage, and then he introduced me to the church. And I left there thinking, I do not want to pastor this church because this church doesn't need anything. And I didn't go into ministry so I could have a good salary. I didn't go into ministry so my kids could be in a safe environment. I didn't go into ministry because I wanted them to go to good schools. I went into ministry so that I could reach lost people for Jesus. And the whole focus of this DS was on the building and the people in the building. And I basically wasn't interested in coming back to pastor this church, but they called me back for a second interview. And, you know, it happened to be in the wintertime, and I was in St. Louis, and Albuquerque was warm, and I thought, well, I'll go back out and do a second interview. Who knows what God might be up to, you know. And so we went back, and this time the DS didn't pick me up. A layman did, who was about 86 years old, and he couldn't drive on the highway. So he picks me up at the airport and takes me up Gibson, up to Central, not Central, Louisiana. And this is through the war zone. He drove me through the war zone. And I thought, now that's a place that I could have an impact. There's lost people. There are actually lost people in the community. So I learned a lesson there in terms of bringing pastors. So when I was the district superintendent, when I brought a pastor in to interview for a church, here's what I would do. I would say, this is a community that has about 19,000 people within 5 miles. here's a church. Here's a salary. That's what we have to give you. Here's your parsonage. Your goal is to take the 250 people that are in this church. Those are called missionaries because they're Christians. The people who attend the church, they're not consumers. They're not customers. They're missionaries. The people that are Christians are missionaries. And you've got 250 missionaries to help you reach the other 19,000 people in your community. So, do you understand the little slight difference in that philosophy of thinking about the church? And so we have to begin to start seeing the church as the called out ones, not the coming in ones. And that's a hard thing for us to adjust to think about. And so then go from marginal to missional. A missional church is a church that spends most of its time and energy thinking about those who are not yet there. So in Albuquerque, I actually ended up taking that church, and this was the church that I wrote all this training on, although I experienced another church like this after leaving there. It was a church of about 220 people, mostly about 99% white, in a city that was 65% Hispanic. I thought, these people are really gifted at ignoring Spanish people. So if you're in a city that has 65% Hispanic and your church is 100% white, somebody's really good at not letting Spanish people in. I mean, you got to have a special talent for that if there's 65% of the population is Hispanic. Now, I'm not hung up on race, but I think the church ought to reflect its community. Not only ethnic, but its socioeconomic diversity as well. And I think Scripture would tell us that's true. And so when I hired staff, I didn't hire staff to minister to the people that were there. I hired staff to take the people who were there and help them minister to the people that were not there. So when I hired a youth pastor, I would raise their salary for 2 years before they came. So if I hired a youth pastor and we were going to pay them $35,000 a year, I would raise $70,000 in advance. You might remember that for that staff person. I'd say, you've got 2 years to reach enough people to pay your salary in 2 years or you won't have a job. So your goal is to take the 25 teenagers that we have. They're missionaries. Why? Because they're believers. They're church attenders. Take those 25 missionaries that you have in your youth group and reach the other 3,500 teenagers that are in your community. That's your mission. Your mission is not to come here and care for these 25 teenagers. Your mission is for you to come in and equip these 25 teenagers to reach the teenagers that are not yet here. Are y'all getting the little difference in what I'm trying to help us understand about the difference between a marginal and missional church? So I'm going to give you some real simple points about this transition if you want to make the transition, and I'm not suggesting that you do it. I don't know about your church, but if your church is a marginal church that needs to become missional, don't do this unless you're willing to suffer. If your church is a marginal church. You don't have to suffer, but the chances are you will if you make this transition. So number one, define what a good church really is. It's an important issue. What is a good church? So it's interesting, when I go out to speak at churches, the pastors usually introduce me to the lawyers and the doctors and the engineers. That's because people think that impresses you. I want to reach the people. I want to meet the people that just came to Jesus. I want to, we're about the Jesus. We're not about doctors. I mean, thank God if a doctor just got saved. I want to meet the doctor, But I don't want to just meet doctors and lawyers and engineers because they're highfalutin church. So it's interesting in conversations with district superintendents when they say things like, now that's a good church. Because I'll be riding with the DS. They'll usually pick me up at the airport and take me to a training or something. And as we go by a city, they'll say, we have a great church in that city. And I ask them, well, tell me why that's a great church. It's really an interesting question. They never thought I would ask something like that. I'm trying to find what they define a great church to be. And normally they define a church by its big. I don't think a great church has anything to do with its size. They define a great church because it has nice facilities. They define a great church because it pays its budgets or it has lots of resources. That's not what defines a good church. What defines a good church is if it does what a church is supposed to do. That is, make disciples. Is it missional? So the way to define a good church is it doing what spiritual things do versus what secular things do, right? So we have to define what a good church really is. So before you start seeking it, it kind of has to be outcome-based. So if we want to become a missional church, what does that look like? And how are we going to define it? And then what you do is, once you define what the church should look like, then you have to put measurable goals and steps in to get to that point. So it's kind of almost outcome-based in terms of, because it's kind of like when I planted a church, I wanted to determine what kind of believer we should produce. Or we could just go to church and get people saved and hope they turned out right, which is what most churches do. And they start hanging out with George, who's a carnal Christian that's never been sanctified and got a rotten, stinking attitude, and he looks at pornography at night, and he drinks beer when his wife's not around, and he occasionally smokes a cigarette, but he's on the board. Now, this happens all the time in the Church of Nazarene. Now, I'm not legalistic, but a spirit-filled person is who you want as an outcome when you're looking for what kind of people you're going to produce. What are they going to look like? So that's why this is very important, to find what a good church is. What do you want your church to produce? And what is a good church? And then number two, pray and listen to the Spirit. Find God's vision for your church. Don't just define, I just want to define what a good church is, and that's who we are. Ask God, God, what do you want our church to be? God may have an idea for what he wants your church to be that doesn't match anything that you think it should be. Does he get to be in charge of his church, or do we? That's a really important question to answer. Whose church is it? Is it our church, or is it his church? If it's his church, guess who gets authority to make the decisions about the church? Guess who doesn't? Us. Now, this sounds real simplistic, but it's just very important that we understand. If you're going to shift from a marginal church to a missional church is a church that's led by the Spirit, directed by the Spirit, not by the board. Now, if the board is Spirit-led, praise God, that's great. But here's how you can tell if the pastor or the board is Spirit-led. Is mission happening? It's just that simple. Then number three, be committed to completing the work. I'm just going to warn you, and I don't know anything about your church. I don't even know who's here, if you're all from one church or if there's a variety of churches represented, because I don't know who attends a church. I may know better tomorrow after the service because I'm preaching here. I'll be able to identify some of you. But at this point, I'm kind of a victim, so I don't know. But, you better think hard and fast. If your church is marginal and you really are committed to seeing it become a missional church, you need to be committed to staying with it all the way through. And I mean that not just lay people, but pastors. Everyone. And I believe that we don't have authority to choose where we go to church. We have the freedom, but we have to understand that God's the one that places us in a church, layman and pastor. And I believe that being a part of a church is like being married. This is where God sent me for a mission. And I love these people that come to me and say, Pastor, we love you and we love your church, but our kids need a better children's department. And there's a church down the street has a really wonderful children's department, and we really want our kids to be in. So what's the church? Is it a place to meet your needs? Is that what the church is? It's here to accommodate all your wishes? Or is it a place for you to serve? Well, what really is a church? Well, we say these things without even realizing we're saying them. And what we're really saying is, hey, the church is for me. And when it stops being for me, I'm going to go find a church that's better for me. And so what you have is these big mega churches blowing up everywhere before COVID. And they're doing all these wonderful things for all the Christians. And what's happening, if I could show you some statistics I showed in the earlier session, I can show you that the Church of Jesus Christ in the United States has gone from 20% of the population in church to about 14% in the last 15 years. And if we don't stop it, there's going to be no one in the church. Because what we're doing is we're getting really good at rearranging the kingdom and very poorly at building it. We're not reaching new people. We're creating new programs that bring the Christians from the divided Baptist church or the Methodist church where the guy's supporting gay rights or the whatever church, and we give them a better environment. So in other words, we're not reaching new people. We're just rearranging it. So if you want to start becoming a church that's reaching new people, and you may already be that. I mean, what I've heard about this church is wonderful. But don't start this work unless you're committed to stay. Here's what I mean. As a district superintendent, when I brought a pastor in, I said, you're going to come. If you accept the church, you got 30 days to be here. 15 of those days, I want you to sit down, and I want you to pray, and I want you to write out what you feel like God's vision is for this church. Now, the really smart guys will say stuff like this. Well, I need to wait till I get there and exegete the community before I give you a vision. There's nothing wrong with that. We should exegete the community. That's a good thing to do. But why did God call you this church, and what is his vision for the church? I think you can get that even if you don't know. Exegeting the community is know how to get there, not where you're going, I think. And so I think it's important that we're willing to commit to that. And I think we should have a vision. And I'm not going to leave until I get that vision accomplished. My vision in Albuquerque, and I did this, I prayed for about 2 weeks before I ever came, after I accepted the call. I actually came out and spent a couple days, and I prayed up on a hill. I prayed for the city, and I felt like God was saying, what his message for me was that we need to preach the gospel and preach holiness to about 500,000 people and build the church to 1,000. That was my vision before I ever came. Church was running 220. That was a really impossible vision. I had no idea what I was getting into. But I made a commitment that I wouldn't go out and preach anywhere. I wouldn't hold a camp meeting. I wouldn't do revivals. And all my ministry, I've done that stuff. I wouldn't go teach anywhere, nowhere for 10 years. I'm staying, I'm going to build that church. And oh man, in the middle of that, the most horrible crisis, when I had the most mad people at me, was always when I got the good calls. That's when the DS would call me to a bigger church. You know, that had better salary and better parsonage and nicer community for my children and a safer environment and better climate. Oh, that's when all that came. In fact, I was right in the middle of the worst time of my ministry in Albuquerque. And I got a call to San Diego First Church. Can you just imagine getting a call to San Diego First Church? On the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, where you watch the whales swim by. And the weather, the average daytime temperature year-round is 76. Yeah. And you play golf every day. Well, only the devil could be behind that call. Because I know I wanted to go. And, but because I had made a commitment to God that I wouldn't leave for 10 years, I had to stay because I had a vision that I'd promised God I would accomplish. And if I hadn't made that commitment, I'd have been gone a long time ago. But I stayed in that church for 14 years, and God helped us to be able to see those visions accomplished. Number 4, stay until his vision's accomplished. See, if you get a vision from God, you have to stay until it's done. You don't get to stay until the pastor preaches a sermon that offends you. You don't get to stay until the pastor talks about money because you haven't been given any. Then you get to complain about him talking about money because you haven't given. I love that one. That's really a fun one when you're pastoring. If people get mad at you and they stop giving, then you start talking about money and they yell at you for talking about money because they stopped giving. That does happen. I know y'all don't believe that, but that actually happens in the church. That's just a fun one when that happens. Well, that's kind of makes you want to leave. And then if you're the pastor and people do that, you want to leave too. You don't want to live through that. I remember we took the pews out and put chairs in. I had half the world mad at me. I thought there must be something demonic about chairs. I mean, this one guy, his name was Lee. He was an Asian guy. I don't even know if he was there when you were there. He might have been. I didn't see him in church for 3 weeks. Now, we had taken the pews out and put chairs in. And there's a good reason for that. All right, I'll explain it to you. The reason we took the pews out and put chairs in is because we had a homeless ministry. We started a homeless ministry. We started preaching to homeless people. We had what's called Church in the Park every Saturday morning from like 6 to 8. We'd preach to about 250, 300 homeless people. His layman from his old church down in Georgia were the people that cooked the meal. They cooked 500 biscuits and a big old vat of sausage gravy every Saturday morning. They started cooking at 2 in the morning for like 300 to 500 people every Saturday morning. They did it for probably, 5 or 6 years. Well, we felt bad that they weren't coming to our church. They were in a bad area of town. In order for them to come, we wanted to disciple these people that got saved at this event. But none of the churches in that area where they lived or weren't living, they were mostly homeless, wanted them to come to their church. They'd come to that church and they'd kick them out. We don't want you here. You move your stuff. We don't want your nasty, filthy stuff around here. Leave. They wouldn't disciple them, so we decided we'll start picking them up. So we started bringing homeless people. We started bringing our vans down, picking them up, bringing them into church. Because they'd gotten saved and we wanted to see them discipled. And actually the reason we started inviting them is because the people that started this church in the park, when people got saved, they would send them to local churches, to the local Episcopalian church or the other churches that were in the urban area down there. We weren't. We were a little bit outside the urban area at that point. And when they did that, they appealed to me. These leaders that started this ministry said, "Man, we think that you're the only church in this city that'll take these people." He said, what they said. And I got criticized by a lot of Nazarene churches for having that reputation. But I think God would like that. So we started picking up homeless people. Well, there's a problem with picking up homeless people. There's prostitutes, a lot of them. I'm not talking about your average I'm talking about nasty prostitutes. I'm talking about prostitutes that would do anything for a fix, anything, for just a fix, or for $5, anything. And we had them come into our church, and they were usually drunk, and sometimes they'd throw up, and sometimes they'd defecate on the pews. Well, we had these nice old traditional pews, they had the wood back and top, and then they had that nice soft thing that you sat on. And when people urinate and defecate on those, it's hard to clean that out. So what do? Well, you can't have homeless people because that'll just mess up your church. Right? Well, that's the answer. That's the default. I said, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to take the pews out and put chairs in because you can take a chair out and spray it down. And it's good. Of course, you never tell your people where that chair ended up next week. You wouldn't do that. But anyways, the point I'm making is you have to stay until his vision's accomplished, not until you get lonely, not until you get tired, not until people leave, not until you don't have a salary. You stay until the vision's accomplished. That's a hard thing because that happened to me. So I was there, and about 6 years in, the church grew from 220 to about 650. I mean, we were just doing great. All of a sudden, some of the Nazarenes got a little mad because we had homeless people coming and because we moved out the pews and put chairs in. And we weren't just reaching homeless people. We were reaching people that had resources and didn't have resources. We just thought the church ought to represent the community, whatever it is. We started reaching African Americans. We started reaching Native Americans. We started reaching Hispanics. One Sunday morning, we hired our first Spanish ministries pastor, Steve Sanchez. Wonderful guy. He was a football player in high school, basketball player, very athletic, sharp guy. His wife was Anglo, and her parents were Nazarene evangelists. I thought it was a pretty good blend to have a white and a Spanish, come together. It'd be a lot easier to accept than just a Spanish couple in a white church that you want to see blended. And so we did that. Well, 3 weeks in, Steve came to my office on Sunday morning before church. And we had a lot of older Nazarene people in the church then, because the church had become quite old. And in fact, that's one of the reasons they called me, because they wanted to see the church transition. They knew that I was young and full of energy, and that, he believes in mission, and we need to reach lost people. And everybody wants to reach lost people until you do. Let's say that again. Everybody wants to reach lost people until you do, because it's messy. It's a lot easier to reach Christians until they come with their agendas, their theologies, their philosophies. And so Steve came to my office. He was in tears, and I said, "What's up, bro?" And this is the kind of guy, he doesn't cry. Steve doesn't cry. And Steve came to my office, and I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I was in the bathroom, and we had 3 stalls that you go into. We had 3 urinals, boom, boom, boom. Three, where you wash your hands, 3 sinks, 3 urinals, and then three stalls, right, where there were the other things, not the urinals. And Steve was in the back urinal, the back stall, the third one out. So he was quite a ways from and so 2 older gentlemen in our church, good people, good Nazarene guys, they were faithful. They were just old school. They were from another generation. They were raised to think that white people worship with white people and Spanish people worship with Spanish people. They saw themselves better than Hispanics. They really, I'm not criticizing them. It's just, they did. They just thought that. And the Spanish people thought they weren't as good as the white people. That's just the way it was in those days. It's just what they thought. It was wrong, but it's what they thought. So Steve said, I was sitting back there, and I heard one of those gentlemen say the other one. So Steve was only 3 weeks in as the adult ministries pastor. He said to his friend, "I never thought I'd see the day when a dirty Mexican was on staff in this church." Steve heard that from the third stall. The point I'm making is, don't say things like that in the bathroom. Just say them to God in your closet, and he'll jack you up. You don't have to worry about Steve doing it. And so Steve was ready to resign. I said, "No, hang in, man. God will change." Well, so what happened was that kind of started a exodus from our church, because I didn't fire Steve, but they wanted me to fire Steve. In fact, Steve's father-in-law, who was kind of a racist white guy, great guy, he's a Nazarene evangelist, he's a good guy, he's just old school, right? And he said, "Mark, I think you've made a mistake hiring Steve." This is his son-in-law. "I think you made a mistake hiring Steve, because I mean, Steve's wonderful. I love him. He's my son-in-law. But he said, I don't think the church is ready for a Spanish ministries pastor yet. His son-in-law. And I called him by name, and I said, I appreciate that, brother. I want you to know that I do. Now, what I'm about to say is going to sound very arrogant. It wasn't. I was just very certain. I don't make decisions as a minister. I don't practice in ministry. I don't think ministry is a practice. I think we do ministry because God tells us. So we're not experimenting. You know, I don't try something until it doesn't work. I find out what God wants, and I do it until it does work. Even if it's hard or lonely or you get broke, because you're driven by mission, not by resource, right? If you're a missional church versus a marginal church. And so we, what time is it? I need 20 minutes. Yeah. And so anyway, I don't even know where I was at.
Talking to his father-in-law.
Oh, yeah. And I called him by name. I love this guy, and I respected him and still do. We're still friends, good friends. I was his DS again. I was the DS in New Mexico for about 4 months during interim, about last year actually. And he was there on the district. He's an ordained elder. I said, brother, I love you. And I said, I want you to know that I'm grateful for your advice. I appreciate it, and I receive it. I said, but I didn't hire Steve because I thought it was a good plan. I didn't hire Steve because I thought he was a good leader. I mean, after God told me to hire him, I investigated those things, and I was grateful that God told me to hire the right person. I did diligence afterwards, but I hired Steve because I felt like God called me to it. Now, if you want me to go back and ask God if he made a bad decision, I'll be happy to do that. But I'm sure that God told me to hire Steve. Now, that sounds pretty arrogant, doesn't it? I mean, it almost sounds cocky for a pastor to say something like that. I promise you I wasn't. I was certain. And because I knew if I hired a Spanish guy, I knew I would have those conversations. If you're a pastor and you think you're going to hire somebody in your church that the congregation isn't going to accept, and you do that without knowing it's God's will, you're a fool. Because it won't work. If it's God's will, it won't work sometimes. Not everything God tells you to do is perfect. If you don't believe that, you haven't probably been in ministry very long. There's times when God told me to do stuff that cost a great deal. One of them was transitioning this church. It was a hard thing. Well, anyway, so Steve did fine, and we started Spanish ministries. We started 3 Spanish churches. The next several years, the church grew from 220 to 1,000. But in that 6 years, from my 5th year in, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, to my 11th year, and I was there 14 years. So from my 5th year to my 11th year, those 6 years. You ready for this? Now, this doesn't have to happen. Probably what I'm about to share with you happened because I wasn't a very good leader. I just confess that up front. I probably didn't know how to be as gracious as I needed to be, and I probably don't have the tenderness that I needed to have. I would just guess that's probably a good reason why. But in the next 6 years, 500 Nazarenes walked out of my church. And it got so bad that I had to make a decision because we kept hiring staff for the people that were not yet there. That I had to make a decision, and they would tell me the reason they left is because they want to strangle me because you're leading wrong, and we don't want. And if we stop tithing and we leave your church, you'll get strangled and you'll eventually leave because you're here for the money, pal. That's what they thought about their pastoral. They really thought that I was in ministry because they thought it was a career instead of a calling. Honestly, they thought it was a career. Ministry is not a career. It's a if ministry is a career, you're in trouble. And your church is in trouble. But it wasn't for me. It was always a calling. And so 500 Nazarenes walked out. Now, they didn't go to hell. They went to Heights First, and they went to Rio Vista, and they went to, all the other Nazarene churches around. So I didn't hurt them. When they left our church, it was like, whoo, Lord, they were not, I didn't do that. That's what they did when they left. I didn't want them to leave. I never wanted anybody to leave my church. I begged them. I pleaded with them not to leave. But they left, and every one of them to the person, when they left, they'd come and sit in my office, and they'd say this to me. They'd say, Pastor, we love you. We love your preaching, and we love what you're doing. But here's what they said. To the person, those 500 people, the ones that came in, and most families did. Usually it was only one of the family members that talked to me. But most families would come and say something to me. It was a church of about 650. It was a pretty good-sized church. So they felt some obligation to the church during those years. They'd say, "We love you. We love the ministry, but Pastor, we don't want to be expected to reach lost people. We don't want to be expected to sit next to a homeless person or by a prostitute. We just want to come to church and pay our tithe. And I said, cool. You don't have to do all this. Just come and pay your tithe. I'm good with that. They said, it's impossible to do that in your church. I said, why? The reason, and here's what they said to me. They said, because something's happened in the last 7 years. See, used to be the people that came to church and paid their tithe got elected to as board members. And they were Sunday school teachers. And they were worship leaders. Now, this weird thing happened. Now, you don't get elected to those roles unless you're like super spiritual. And we're pretty fine where we're at spiritually, thank you very much. That's what they basically told me. Does everybody understand what I'm explaining here? So what happens in a church becomes missional is the level of commitment, the tide of commitment rises in the church. And the people that like their level of commitment back here are not going to stay because they don't have the same credibility, the same personal self-value that they had before the church transition. And if they're not going to be getting elected, here's the funny thing. Almost every family left my church within 2 months was already a board member in the new church they went to. Boom. Because the level of commitment was so low in the average church. And it wasn't that I had set the level of commitment up. It was that the new people that got saved really got saved. And they got sanctified. They were on fire for God. They wanted to change the world. And that created some tension with some of the more traditional Nazarenes. So, I'll just confess again, I probably didn't do as good a job of assimilating people as I should have. I'm sure that I'm responsible for most of those people exiting our church, but that's just what happened. So, number 5, love everybody. New and old, fresh and stale. Pastors, you don't get to choose who you love. You don't get to just love new people. You don't get to just love lost people. And Christians, you don't get to just love stale people. You don't get to just love the people who've been in your Sunday school class for 30 years. No, you're called to love everybody. New people, old people, stale people, cold people, hot people, on fire people, cool people. We're supposed to love everybody. What happens in a church is sometimes that tension rises because we think we should only love the new people that are excited about Jesus. I can't tell you the times I had to sit down with new Christians and say, chill. Just chill. Don't be so spiritual. Just be normal. Because these other people are offended by this. I mean, I really would have conversations. And they'd say, Pastor, I can't help it. And I'd talk to the traditional people and I'd say, hey, just come and pay your tithe. I'm good with that. I mean, honestly, I tried to, but they wouldn't. Because the whole culture of the church had changed. So when the church begins to move, now I'm just telling you that you don't have to lose people to make these transitions. I had a guy in my church in Atlanta. We started reaching African Americans. In Atlanta, church grew from when I came there, maybe we were running 300 in 2.5 years. This is phenomenal. It was the greatest experience of ministry of my life. We went in 2.5 years from about 300 to 850. Boom, just like that. And a larger portion of that were African Americans. First thing I did was I hired a black guy and put him on the platform. Because the community had 275,000 blacks within 5 miles. And I thought, well, it'll reflect the community. Had one of my old saints. He was a saint. He was a godly man, just old school. He came to me and he said, Pastor, he said, I'm concerned about our church. So why would you be concerned about a church that's gone from 300 to 550? I mean, in a year and a half. Why would that concern you? I said, why? I mean, I was confused. Why? What's going on? He said, I'm just afraid that our church might become a black church. You afraid that it might become a black church? I said, why would that be a problem? So the color of the people in your church is relevant to you? I know we all kind of look at that as, oh, not me, pal. But yeah, most of us are probably the same way at some level. Hopefully not, but most of us probably are. And he said, I don't know what to do. I said, brother, you can prevent it. I said, I'll tell you how you can keep this church from ever becoming an all-black church. He said, how? I said, never leave. There'll always be a white guy. There'll always be somebody white. I did. He and I were friends. We could be honest with each other, and I was, and he was. So love everybody. Number 6, What is the outcome you seek for new disciples? We already talked about this. And is that happening, and will your present systems and structures lead to that? This is an important question. If you're going to transition from a marginal to missional church, you've got to understand what a missional church looks like. And do your systems that you have currently, will they lend to that happening? Here's how you can tell. Is it happening? Because if it's not happening, that's the best evidence there ever was that the systems you have in place are not designed to make that happen. Because the systems, the structures, the habits, the behaviors, and the actions of your organizations are perfectly designed to produce the results you're getting. That's why you're getting them. Because the systems, the habits, the actions of that organization are actually doing the things that are producing that result. So if you want to change a result, what do you have to do? Change the systems, the habits, the actions, the behaviors. It's called organizational seriousness. What are you going to change about your organization to make sure the outcomes are going to be what you're really looking for? You can talk about changing outcomes all you want, but if you don't change systems, forget about it. Anybody that's ever been in business knows this. You know, it's just a basic fact of life. Number 7, decide what his vision for your church will look like when it's completed. What do we want our church to look like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? How many people? What kind of people? Then, after you decide that, then you ask yourself, how do I get there? And then you start working on systems. Go back, okay, what do we need to change to make sure that we accomplish that? And the first thing that needs to change is probably your heart. My heart. Layperson and staff. It's the first thing, because that's where it generally kind of is generated. That's where systems are generated from, usually. And I'll say that confessionally as a minister that made a lot of mistakes in those areas in my life. Number 8, what will it take to move this church to the place God wants it? What are the costs? Paul says that. He said if you're going to build a building, you need to count the cost before you do it. What's it going to take? I thought I knew what it would take for us to transition our church. I was way off. I had no idea that I'd see 500 Nazarenes leave. I would never have guessed it. Here's the cool thing. In the middle of all that, after we lost about 400, I had somebody come to me. They said, Pastor, it's amazing what God's done, because in those years, not once did we ever have a decline in attendance. We lost 75 people a year for 6 years. Not once did we ever have a decline in attendance. We always reached more than we lost. But we didn't lose them. They didn't go to hell, remember? They went to Heights, and they went to Rio Vista, and they went to other churches. So they didn't, we weren't kicking them out. They just decided to go somewhere else. So it wasn't like, we lost them. But what will it take to move this church to the place God wants it to be? Think about the cost. Count the cost. I don't think that you'll ever really know what all the costs are, but you should try to count the cost and ask yourself if you're willing to pay that price. If I'd have known, I just have to say, if I'd have known what I'd have had to pay, I'm still paying for that. I'll give you a couple of examples, some things that happened during those 6 years when all those Nazarenes left. After 6 years, the 500 were gone. The church just exploded. We went from 300 to 1,000 in 14 years. God just blessed the church. But for 6 of those years, about the 5th year in, when all these people had left, I had to make a decision. Either I was going to have to fire half my staff, or 2/3 of my staff, or I was going to have to stop taking a salary. Now, I had a salary about $110,000. I had professional expenses. I was pastoring a church of about 800 when this happened. I had to make a decision. I wasn't going to stop ministry, so I just prayed. The Lord said, stop getting paid. Tell them to stop paying you. So I went to the board the next Sunday. And I said, I've been praying about this, guys, and I think that we're going to face a financial dilemma, because we're not going to stop hiring staff, because and a lot of people have left that gave a lot of money. I had one guy leave that gave like $95,000 a year, every year. That's a pretty big hit. If somebody gives $95,000 a year, leaves your church in one day, you got to figure out how to survive, right? I knew these things were happening, and God had given me some insight from prayer. And I said, you're going to stop paying me tomorrow, but you got to give me 2 days off a week, 2 days a week. You let me off Monday and Tuesday. I'll be back to preach Wednesday night. We had a Wednesday night service. If I can leave Sunday night after church and be back Wednesday night for church, I can stay your pastor. I'll do everything I'm doing, and we won't have to fire any staff, and we'll keep going. So for 10 years, no, 6 years, For 6 years, I didn't take $1 salary from that church, but we never fired a staff member, and we never stopped ministry, and God helped us to keep going. And so God helped us through that. Another thing, during those 6 years, we had budgets that came due. Well, I'm of the opinion that if I'm a part of the Nazarene church, I have a responsibility to take care of my responsibilities. Like if I live in a house and I get electricity, I think I should pay for that electricity. I was in a church that agreed to paying budgets, and I was going to commit to that. And one year we had a $25,000 shortfall. 2 weeks before the end of the church year, I'd never pastored a year in my life when we didn't pay budgets, never. And I wasn't about to, so I prayed. And so you won't believe God told me this, but I'm convinced he did. He said, you pay those budgets. So I tried to raise the money and didn't get it raised. So I went to the bank and personally borrowed $25,000 to pay our budgets. I did that for 3 years. I borrowed up to $175,000 personal debt from individuals. It took me 13 years to pay it back, $2,500 a month. It was my mortgage. But I got them paid back. But I never lived a year without paying my budgets. That's how important that was to me. But that's what this crisis led us into, just so that you'll understand. And so when I say, what will it take to take your church to where it needs to be, just understand this is the issue of prayer, and you need to really be ready. But I don't think you have to take those losses, because I'm sure your leaders are much wiser than I was if you're a marginal church. I'm not convinced that any church is, but that's something the church has to decide. But you need to find out the cost before you get into it. Number 9, make mission the priority and bring everyone along. Don't leave anybody. I think I left people. I allowed people to polarize me as a pastor. People demonized me, said bad things about me. One guy called me Hitler. Another guy called me a cult leader. I mean, I got called all kinds of crazy. They still do. Still, those people left our church. And here's why: because they thought it was their church. When they left, they accused me of taking their church from them. I mean, those words, exactly. Of course, I never took that as a personal indictment, but it still hurts. You know, I never had anybody leave my church that didn't break my heart. I wept over every person that left my church, and I didn't want them to leave. So it wasn't that I wanted them to go. It's just that I just probably wasn't very wise in the transition. And I didn't realize to take everybody. I was young, and I thought, we're going to, my thinking back in the back of my head was, hey, look, we don't have enough seats now. If you want to leave, that'll free up 3 seats. God bless you. Now, isn't that a horrible thing for a pastor to think? But at that point in my life, that's what I thought. And it's okay to think you need space for lost people. It's all right to think that. What's not okay is to think that the lost person is more valuable than the person that's already there. That's what's not okay. And because everybody is valuable. And that's something as a young pastor I didn't get, and I needed to get better. Number 10, don't allow others, yourself, the culture of your church, or leaders in the community to polarize you against others. Be careful of unhealthy alliances. When people start pulling you aside and telling you, we got a great pastor, but when they start putting their butts in the conversation, that's when you have a problem. Don't let those things go. If a church transitions, don't let it go. If somebody says you have a great pastor, but, say, hold on, wait a minute. I want to hear what your but is. I want to know that, and we're going to talk about that. Because if it's true, we're going to go talk to the pastor about it, because you're not going to talk to me badly about somebody else. That would be gossip. If you got something negative to say about our pastor, you're going to say it to him with me present. You're not going to say it to me. It's kind of like if I were sitting with, James in my office privately, and there are 10 people in the church that don't like James because he's too aggressive or whatever. And we're sitting in my office, and James and I are talking, and he goes, man, I love you, Pastor. And I leave the office, and somebody says to me, hey, I love James, but, I said, yeah, it was kind of weird. We were in this meeting, and he touched my shoulder. And that was kind of weird, So what's that person going to think about James the next time they see him? They're thinking he's gay. And all I had to do is just put that little thought in his brain, and he thinks that. Now, James is not gay. I hope. I don't think so. But that's just an illustration. But I'm just saying that's how quickly gossips and slander destroys an organization. And don't allow that. If anybody ever comes to you, do not let people speak ill of anybody without them being there. I got in deep trouble at Global Ministry Center for this. When I first got there 3 years ago, there was a guy in our denomination that was doing some wild stuff, kind of like charismatic type stuff. And They were a leader in our church, and I was called into a meeting with some general leaders. And they said, we are concerned about this person, and this person did this person did that, this person did this person did that. We've looked at the videos, we've heard, and they started talking bad about this guy. And I sat there feeling like I needed a shower. And when I left that meeting, I felt horrible. I went and fasted and prayed and asked God to forgive me. And the Lord said, you're going to have to go back and confront each of those men. These are general leaders. These are people that I could lose my job on. By the way, I'm going to give you a quick principle that I learned early in my ministry that helped me. Who you are as a Christian is best expressed by how you treat those who can't hurt you or can't help you. Who you are in character is best described or expressed by how you treat those who can't help you or hurt you. I had to go back and tell every one of those guys that was wrong, it was inappropriate, that was slander. And I said, don't ever call me into another meeting where you're going to talk about someone that's not present, because I won't allow it. It's never going to happen again. Gossip will destroy a church that's in transition. It's a huge, horrible thing. Well, we're out of time, aren't we? Okay. So I'm going to show you real quickly, and then we're going to go to the next session, which won't take as long. Yeah. So a marginal church, here's some of the basic tendencies of marginal church. And you have this, Pastor, don't you, on the slides? So if anybody needs this, we're not going to take time to read it, but these are some of the things that happen in a marginal church. Has more facilities than it needs. Staff is hired to care for existing flock. These are things we've already talked about. A few professions of faith. Most of the people that join your church are transfers from other denominations or other churches. Giving is good, but only a few give. Only a small percentage of your church gives. Anyway, that's kind of a marginal church tendencies. And then a transitional church is the way you get when you're in the middle between moving the church from marginal to missional. A transitional church has these basic tendencies. And again, these slides you're going to have, so if you need to look at them later, you can ask the pastor and he can show them to you. If you noticed, in a marginal church, just look back here, all the arrows, almost without exception, are pointed in. So everything's about us. In a transitional church, every arrow is red. Nothing is easy when the church is transitioning, because you're trying to reach lost people with the same resources you had with the people that were there. And it becomes a huge stretch of finance to try to do that. Because what you'll try to do as a pastor in a transitional stage is you'll try to keep everybody happy that's there. So you want to keep all the ministries and all the activities going so they don't get mad at you while you add new ones. Well, that costs money and resource and time and energy. So what you're doing is you're exhausting yourself and you're exhausting your resources in a transitional moment. Does everybody understand that basic premise? So everything is almost red. Then in a missional church, everything changes. Notice all the white arrows are pointing out. In other words, in a missional church, in a marginal church, you got to fight to get anybody to spend any money for lost people. In a missional church, you got to fight to spend any money for us. In a marginal church, you have to fight to get anybody to do ministry for people outside the church. In a missional church, you almost have to argue to get people to do something for people inside the church. They're more focused on the lost, more focused on the outreach, those kinds of things. All right, now we're going to take a few minutes and take some questions. Anybody have any questions? I've talked about a lot of stuff.
In all these churches that you were pastoring, you went through the transition phase.
Yeah.
So, just planning through that, you acknowledge that with the board, you say, hey, look, we're in a transition. I would say we're in a transition phase.
Okay.
I would say because we took two churches that
Yeah.
were probably marginal,
That's tough. Yeah.
merged them with a mission mindset to become this community-related church.
Right.
I think the heart of both congregations can see that we need to be more missional
Mm-hmm.
and want to be more missional. The inroads are a little tougher than we anticipated.
Yes, they will be. They always are.
Because we're in that odd space. We're in a affluent white community
Mm-hmm.
that borders a largely Hispanic, largely socioeconomically deprived area.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission field is probably more in there than it is here, but then we know there's still a very large mission here
Mm-hmm.
as well. So I think we're in that transitional phase of how do we become that church that will bless
Yeah, that's tough. I think the answer is your people have to be bought, they have to have buy-in before you do it. And I think, so the difference between Sandia, which we worked through it, but it was painful. I would not advise anybody to do what I did for no reason. It was just too costly. I lost too many friends. I lost too many people I loved. There's too much hurt. I just wouldn't advise it. I think it was the right thing. I wouldn't advise you to go die on a cross for lost people either. I mean, that's hard, right? That hurts. But I felt like it was God's will. Now, the church at Atlanta was different because they were ready to do something, and your church may be there. Most of the people at Atlanta First were tired of doing nothing for 50 years. And they were ready to do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, we're ready to go, man. And when I came there, I said to them, this is what we're going to do, and this is what it's going to cost. And they had buy-in. They were ready to go. So God helped us. We went right through it. So I think you have to exegete who your people are first and where they're at. Then you have to bring them along. Here's the thing I would do. One thing that I didn't do at Sandia, I'd find out why, or whatever we're going to do, whatever our mission statement was, I'd make a list of whatever those specific things were that we thought we needed to do, the outcome-based stuff we talked about earlier. And who's going to hate those things? Write their names down. Who's going to hate them? And then write next to their name why they're going to hate them. Before you ever think about doing it, answer those questions about how you're going to deal with those hates before you start. And put those in your vision statement, the answers to those objections. That's just the basic leadership 101, right? You determine what the challenges are before you present the vision. What most leaders do is what I did at Sandia. I said, this is where we're going. And they said, okay, see ya. And I didn't think about their objections. I didn't think about what would be hard for them to accept. I just didn't think about it. I just wasn't that smart. But you guys are much smarter than I was. I can tell that. You're a lot sharper than me. So you'll be able to process through that. But the key to this is having a great prayer focus. I had a great group of prayer warriors that were with us through the Sandia process. Atlanta First had people praying for years, and they were ready for this transition, and so it was quite easy. At Atlanta, I don't think I had one person leave in that transition, one. And that person left because we stopped doing a Easter drive-through where they had stations at the cross. We had 38 acres in Atlanta First, and it was all woods behind the church. So they would go back and do a bush hog around the outside of the church, back there all down through the fields, and they would come out and put a cross here and some words on it, and then they put a cross here and some words on it. So all the really deeply spiritual, more traditional Nazarenes loved going on Easter Sunday just thinking, oh, Jesus died. Oh. The next cross, Mary came. Do you feel like Mary? Because there'd be words about Mary. And then, how did Martha feel about this? And these were like very special moments for traditional Nazarenes. But nobody ever came to Jesus through that. And it wasn't me that did it. It was my youth pastor. And my youth pastor came and said, Pastor, I don't want to do this anymore because it's too much resource and nobody's getting saved. Can I stop it? I said, well, yeah, you can stop if you want to. Guess who gets the hit when you do that? The pastor. So this family came to me and said, I never thought I'd see the day when the pastor of our church didn't care about Easter. What we did, instead of doing the drive-through, we did an Easter outreach event. We did Easter egg hunt, and we had a gospel presentation, and like 250 people came to Christ. Our worship attendance was 2,600 that Sunday. The church that was running maybe 500. 2,600. But that didn't matter. We didn't do our stations of the cross, buddy. And they left my church. I couldn't believe it. Was I forgetting about Easter? No, that's what Easter's about, is lost people. Well, but it only happened for a year. They came back a year later, and they said, we were wrong. We've tried to find the church that's doing what our church is doing. There's not one. They repented and asked, please, can we come back? And that really happened. But, so I don't, that probably didn't answer your question very well, but I just think a lot of prayer in advance and try to answer those objections before they come. When you start reaching Hispanic people, if you're going to do that, how are they going to blend into your church? What are the challenges going to be when that happens? Or are you going to try to do a multi-congregation versus versus instead of doing multicultural, doing multi-congregational? Which one are you going to do? Most people go multicultural versus multi-congregational. Do you understand the difference? So a multicultural church is a church that's blended on worship people from all different cultures come and worship together. A multi-congregational church is white people worship at 9 a.m., the Spanish worship at 11, the blacks worship at 1. That's multi-congregational. I'm not suggesting that either of them are wrong, but you need to decide that before you start. And then ask yourself, if we're going to do the multicultural one, what are the challenges and how are we going to deal with that in advance? Now we're going to present answers to those questions that will be presented if we do it. I think that's as simple as, and I'm all out of time. So that was a great question. Anybody else? Will take one more question before we go on that relates to transitioning a church. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about safety, I guess. I work in the children's department, so when you're bringing in people that, people don't feel is desirable or whatever, they might have legal issues that would make it difficult for children. Have you done anything to, bring about safety in that and making sure that, some people have to be separated from children and stuff? How do you
Yeah.
do that when you're really reaching out to the community?
Yeah, we did. Everybody had to be trained in Nazarene Safe and certified. Everybody. Every leader in our church. And they are now at TLC. That's a really hard, that's a long answer if I answered it the way I wanted to, and I probably don't have time. I may get into a portion of it here. But I think for me, the best answer, and just understand my answers aren't the best answers. These are just the ones that I know. So don't think that I don't think I know anything. So I'm just going to share my experiences about that. If you're trying to build a church where there's no risk or danger, you'll never build your church. Well, you might build your church, you won't build the kingdom. Because if your focus is, I know you're not saying that your focus is safety. I understand your concerns. So I'll just give you an illustration. In Kansas, in St. Louis, when I pastored the Southwest Church of St. Louis, it was in an urban area when I took it. Southwest Church. Has anybody ever been to St. Louis? You know that church? So it's right in the middle of the really bad part. It's not Ferguson, but it's like for the south side of the city, it's in a bad area. Right next to the gardens, the big botanical gardens area. And it was all black. Everyone within 2 miles of that church was black and poor, but everyone in the church was white and middle income. Everyone. It was the old Lafayette Park Church. Church used to run 950 in the 50s. It was the greatest church in the Nazarene movement. When I show up, they have a sanctuary seat 700, and they got 65 white people coming to churches. They're bouncing off the walls, man. There's just nobody there. So we felt like we needed to reach lost people. Well, we started reaching. We reached a middle, upper income white couple, wonderful couple. We were reaching black kids as well, bringing them in on buses and other things. So we were trying to do both. And one Sunday, this new couple that I had invested so much, I used to go to St. Louis Rams games with him, and I'd go to the Cardinals games with him. Just wonderful friend. Clean family. They had two beautiful, beautiful daughters. They had this skin was like porcelain, just beautiful, these little innocent, little beautiful white girls, and they're coming to this church in the inner city. It just seemed weird, but we had committed to being a missional church. Well, one Sunday he came to me because we had this building next to the church that was kind of like it was like an old doctor's office. They had little corridors, and they had this one circular staircase that went up. It was the coolest thing for kids because the walls, the ceilings, and the floor were all made out of ceramics. You couldn't hurt the thing. So kids could go in there and just do anything they want. They wouldn't hurt it. Just clean it off. It's fine. No problem. So the kids just loved that area, It's like a playground for them. Well, one day, this guy came to me with his wife, and he said, "Pastor, we don't know what to do." And he said, our girls have always felt safe, but he said, "I have to tell you that our girls do not feel safe in your church." I said, "Well, why? What happened?" He said, "Well, today during Sunday school, my two girls were up at the top of the little corridor, and two black kids that were very large and very scary, they kind of blocked them in and said, 'You're not going down until you give us your money.' And these two little girls were just scared to death. And these are friends, the people that I hung out with. My girls, were younger than theirs, but we were good friends. And I was just, oh, no. But we'd have things happen in that church. We'd have Paddy Wagon come pick up a couple teenagers sometimes on Sunday because they were breaking glass and acting up because they didn't have anybody at home that taught them how to act, The church was the only hope they had, for any kind of a future, these kids. And so I said, I don't know, but I'm going to have to call. I'm going to have to pray. I don't know the answer to this question. I can't tell you the answer because I was in a real quandary. Did I affirm him and say, I love you and I want your kids to be safe? Or do I say to him, I don't think it's possible to do real ministry and be safe? I didn't know the answer. But I knew somewhere in between those two was the right answer. I prayed and I made a decision and I knew I'd lose them. I knew that they would leave. Came into my office and I said, I got to tell you that I love you guys. Y'all are probably our best friends in the church. I'm so sorry that happened to your kids. I said, I'll do everything I can to prevent any of that from ever happening again. I said, I'm going to try to lock that staircase up where nobody can go in there. And we'll try to have more supervision of adults and all these things. I said, but I have to tell you, it's impossible for me to promise you that there will ever come a time in this church where your kids will not feel at some level threatened because we're reaching lost people. And if you have to have a church where you're not ever feeling threatened, probably this is not your church. And I said that with tears because I loved them. But I wasn't going to let a sense of fear in a family prevent us from doing ministry. I just couldn't do it. And you know what they said? They said, Pastor, we've been praying this week too, and my wife and I decided this morning that if you told us that you were going to change your whole church's mission to keep us safe, we were going to leave. He said that to me. Now in my church in Albuquerque, we had pedophiles attending our church. And we had a daycare that would house 125 kids. 3 months ago, I'm not there any longer, but 3 months ago, I got a call from Pete Myers, who was, your lay people's nephews. He said, you're not going to believe this. It may have been 6 months ago. He said, there was a shooting outside of our church, and he said, I just went out, and he said, I just dug out 2 bullets from the wall that it's a covered, blocked wall that's painted where you can't see inside. There's kids in there playing during daycare. And a guy got out of his car, and he got into a gunfight with cops right next to the church. And he said, I dug out 2 lead bullets from the fence where our kids were worshiping, or they were in there for daycare. And he said, man, I was in a quandary, I didn't know what to do. Well, with the pedophiles, what we did is basically said, you can't be within 100 yards of any kid ever. If you ever are, you're done. You're no longer welcome in this church, So I'm telling you up front, we want you here, we love you. But if you get within 100 yards or 50 yards or whatever it was, whatever the federal law is and the state law for that particular area, there are rules on what a pedophile can do and can't do around kids. I said, these are the rules, bro, and we love you. We want to embrace. We had one guy come into our church that had sexually molested his 6-year-old granddaughter and spent 10 years in prison for it. And he was sad and remorseful, and he wanted to be forgiven and repented, and I told him that. I said, if you want to come to this church, here are the rules, pal. If I ever see you looking at a child, ever even looking at a child, you're done. And I didn't realize then how perverted people that are sick like this are. They really are sick. They're messed up. But most of those people we kept, and there was never an issue. We never had an issue. But every person was trained in Nazarene safe, and everyone was certified. You have to do it every 2 years. So I don't know how well that answers your question. It's probably not the answer you were looking for, but that's kind of my answer. Yeah, it's not the answer I wanted, particularly if it had been my kid, but it was the answer I would have followed and did with my kid. And my kids were raised and are doing great. Both of them are serving Jesus. They're both in the church. They're doing wonderful. And they were raised in that environment pretty much most of their lives. Okay. All right, well, we're only about 25 minutes past. But so we're going to go right into the next one, how to do a mass evangelism event. You ready? Let's take 5. Let's just take a 5-minute break, all right? Go to the bathroom or get some water. And if anybody's got any other questions, I'll be happy to talk to you give you my poor judgment on issues.